The sun was bright that morning, and the air carried a calmness that made the day feel special. The elderly woman, dressed in her neat but modest clothes, decided to take a little trip she had been thinking about for weeks. For a long time, she had admired the beauty of luxury cars. Whenever she saw one passing by on the road, she would smile quietly to herself, wondering what it might feel like to sit inside one, to hold the steering wheel, and to imagine driving it even just once in her lifetime. She was not there to buy a car, at least not at that moment. She simply wanted to look, to ask questions, and to enjoy the experience of stepping into a place where dreams often lived. For her, this was not about money or showing off. It was about curiosity, joy, and the excitement of doing something out of the ordinary. Age had slowed her steps, but not her spirit. Deep inside, she still had the same spark of wonder she had carried as a young girl. When she reached the dealership, she paused outside for a few seconds. Large glass windows reflected the sunshine, and behind them sat rows of shining vehicles that looked almost like pieces of art. Their polished surfaces gleamed like mirrors, and their designs spoke of elegance and power. The woman took a deep breath, smoothed down her simple dress, and stepped forward with quiet confidence. She knew she might not look like the usual customers, but she carried herself with dignity. As she entered, the smell of leather and new interiors filled the air. The atmosphere inside was calm but also serious, with salesmen in pressed suits moving about, talking to customers in low voices, and occasionally pointing toward different models. She walked slowly, her eyes glowing with curiosity, as if she were exploring a museum of dreams. Every car seemed to have its own personality: sleek sports cars that promised speed, grand sedans that spoke of power, and SUVs that looked ready to conquer any road. Her heart lifted when she saw a black sedan that reminded her of a car she once saw in a magazine years ago. She moved closer, almost forgetting the world around her, and admired its details: the smooth lines of the body, the shine of the wheels, and the fine interior she could see through the glass. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about her age or her simple life. She was just a woman enjoying beauty, and that was enough. She whispered softly to herself, almost as though talking to the car, "You are so beautiful. I wonder what it feels like to drive you." Her words were filled with genuine admiration, the kind that comes from the heart. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply enjoying a little dream in her own quiet way. For her, this visit was an adventure. It was like stepping into another world, one she had only seen from a distance. She thought of how, when she was younger, she never had the chance to explore such places. Life had always been about responsibility, about raising her family, about working hard to make ends meet. She had never been the type to chase after material things, but now, at her age, she allowed herself this little joy. She wanted to see, to feel, and to experience something new because life, she believed, was still full of surprises. No matter how old you are, the staff at the dealership walked past her, some glancing her way briefly, but she didn't mind at first. She thought perhaps they were busy with other customers. She smiled politely at a young salesman as he rushed past, but he didn't return the smile. Still, she kept her spirits high. After all, she hadn't come here for their attention. She had come for herself, for this quiet adventure that meant so much more than anyone around her could see. Slowly, she leaned closer to one of the cars and placed her hand gently on the cool, polished surface. The smoothness beneath her fingers made her chuckle softly. "So cold, but so fine," she murmured. To her, it was almost like touching a piece of history, a rare treasure. She imagined herself inside, sitting comfortably in the soft seats, looking out at the road ahead and maybe even driving it down her neighborhood street. The thought made her laugh, and her laughter carried the innocence of a child. The dealership was filled with shiny objects, but none of them sparkled as much as the joy in her eyes. Every step she took, every detail she noticed, added to her excitement. She didn't care about the price tags. She didn't care about the opinions of others. She was lost in a simple moment of happiness, enjoying the beauty that surrounded her. Little did she know, this small visit, this quiet act of curiosity, would soon lead to an incident that would not only hurt her heart, but also change everything. For now, though, she was simply an elderly woman enjoying a morning filled with wonder, unaware that others were silently watching her and making unfair judgments to her. This was just an ordinary visit, a chance to explore, to admire, and to remind herself that life was still worth living with excitement, no matter her age. But to the dealership staff who failed to see her spirit, this ordinary visit would become something far different. And in that difference lay the beginning of a story that would shake their pride and reveal the true meaning of respect. Asterisk. When the elderly woman first stepped inside, she thought her presence would be welcomed just like any other visitor. She believed that a dealership, a place that sold dreams on four wheels, would treat every guest with warmth and courtesy. But almost immediately, she noticed something strange in the air. The staff didn't look at her with smiles or friendly greetings. Instead, their eyes flickered with quick judgments, like they had already decided who she was and what she was worth before she even spoke. At first, she brushed it off. She thought maybe they were just busy or distracted. She gave them the benefit of the doubt because that was her nature, kind, patient, and hopeful. She walked slowly around the showroom, still admiring the gleaming cars, waiting for someone to come over and offer help. But the minutes ticked by, and no one approached. Salesmen who had hurried over to greet younger couples or men in business suits completely ignored her, as though she were invisible. When she finally gathered the courage to walk toward one of the salesmen, her voice was soft yet polite. "Excuse me," she said with a gentle smile. "Could you tell me a little about this model?" She pointed at the black sedan that had caught her heart earlier. The salesman barely glanced at her before letting out a short, dismissive laugh. "That one. It's very expensive. Maybe you'd like to see something more affordable." His words were sharp, cutting through her excitement like a blade. The woman blinked, stunned by his tone. She hadn't said she couldn't afford it. She hadn't even asked about the price yet. All she wanted was to know more, to learn, to experience. But already, she felt her spirit shrinking. Still, she refused to give up. With a little more courage, she asked again, "Yes, but could you please tell me about it? I'd like to know the details." This time, the salesman sighed, as if she were wasting his precious time. He muttered a few words about horsepower and leather seats, speaking so quickly and carelessly that it barely made sense. Then, without waiting for her reply, he turned and walked away to greet another man who had just entered, a man in a shiny watch and expensive shoes. The elderly woman stood there, her lips pressed together, her hands folded in front of her. She felt small, almost unwanted. Her heart sank a little, but she tried to stay strong. She had faced worse moments in her long life. She thought perhaps another staff member would be kinder. She walked toward a second salesman, a younger man with a bright tie. She asked him politely if she could sit inside one of the display cars, just to see how it felt. He looked her up and down, his eyes filled with doubt, and shook his head. "Ma'am, these cars are not for sitting unless you're a serious buyer. We can't allow people to just climb in." Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. The words stung, not because she wanted to waste their time, but because she was being treated differently than others. Just moments earlier, she had seen a couple being invited to sit inside the very same model. The salesman had opened the door for them with a wide smile, encouraging them to enjoy the experience. Why was she not given the same respect? She took a small step back, clutching her handbag a little tighter. She tried to remind herself that her worth wasn't measured by their attitudes. But deep down, the coldness in their voices and the looks in their eyes hurt her deeply. She had come with excitement and curiosity, but now she felt a heavy weight of shame pressing down on her shoulders. Finally, one of the senior sales staff approached. His expression was stern, his body language sharp. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "if you're not here to make a purchase, we'd appreciate it if you didn't linger too long. We have serious clients to attend to." The words hit her like a slap. She had never felt so small, so unimportant. She wasn't loitering. She wasn't causing trouble. She was simply looking, asking, dreaming. Yet in their eyes, she was nothing more than a burden. The elderly woman lowered her gaze, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wanted to say something back, to remind them that every person deserves respect, but her voice refused to rise. Her pride held her upright, but her heart felt bruised. Slowly, she turned and began to walk toward the exit, her steps heavy with disappointment. Behind her, the staff returned to their polished smiles for other customers, as though nothing had happened. But they didn't see what they had broken. They didn't see the spark that had dimmed in her eyes. To them, she was just another stranger they had dismissed. To her, it was a wound she would carry home, a wound made not of sticks or stones, but of careless words and unkind stares as she stepped outside. The sun still shone brightly, but it no longer warmed her heart. The cars behind the glass now seemed colder, distant, no longer beautiful. What should have been a joyful little adventure had turned into a bitter memory. And though she walked away with quiet dignity, inside she knew she had been wronged in a way that went far deeper than the surface. Little did the dealership know that the woman they had treated so poorly was not alone in this world. She had someone in her life who valued her more than any luxury car. Someone who would soon turn this painful moment into a lesson they would never forget. Asterisk. The elderly woman stood near the entrance, unsure of what to do next. She had hoped for kindness, maybe even just a smile or a patient answer, but instead she had been treated like an intruder. Still, part of her wanted to give the dealership one last chance. She turned back and glanced again at the shining black sedan that had first caught her eye. Something about it still pulled her heart, reminding her of the little dream that had brought her here in the first place. Gathering her courage, she walked slowly toward the car. Her steps were careful, her eyes wide with both admiration and sadness. She leaned slightly to peek inside, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she could take a closer look before leaving. Her wrinkled hands pressed lightly on the glass, almost as if she were touching a piece of a dream that didn't belong to her. That small gesture was enough to draw the attention of one of the salesmen. His face tightened with irritation, as though her mere presence was a problem. He marched over, his shoes clicking sharply against the polished floor, and stood in front of her. "Ma'am," he said, in a tone that was more command than courtesy, "I already told you these cars are for serious buyers. Please don't touch them." His words cut through her like ice. She stepped back quickly, embarrassed, whispering, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean any harm. I just wanted to look," but the salesman didn't soften. Instead, he looked around to see if anyone else had noticed and then lowered his voice with a cold edge. "Look, we don't have time for this. If you're not here to purchase, you shouldn't be here at all. Please leave." The elderly woman froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never imagined being spoken to in such a way, not for simply admiring a car. Her cheeks burned with shame as she realized what was happening. She wasn't just being ignored anymore, she was being pushed out. She tried to gather her dignity, standing tall despite her trembling hands. "I only asked a question," she replied softly. "There's no need to treat me like this." But the salesman rolled his eyes and gestured toward the door. "Ma'am, please. We have other customers. You're wasting our time. This is not a place for window shopping." The humiliation sank deeper with each word. Other people in the showroom had started to notice. A couple by the counter glanced at her, then whispered quietly to each other. Another customer smirked, as if amused by the scene. The elderly woman's throat tightened. She wanted to vanish, to escape the eyes that looked at her as though she didn't belong. Slowly, she began to walk toward the door, but the final blow came when another staff member, perhaps wanting to end the situation quickly, stepped forward and actually guided her by the elbow. His touch wasn't too rough, but it was firm enough to make her feel like an unwelcome guest being escorted out. The glass doors slid open, and just like that, she was standing outside again, the bright sunlight blinding her for a moment. Behind her, the dealership returned to its smooth rhythm salesman, smiling. Customers browsing as though her humiliation had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. She stood there silently for a long time, staring at her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her wasn't just elderly. She looked tired, small, and unwanted. Her shoulders slumped as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She thought about all the years she had lived, the hardships she had endured, the struggles she had overcome. Never had she felt so disrespected for simply being curious, for simply daring to step into a place that others thought wasn't for her. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She refused to let them fall in public. She had always taught her children to hold their heads high, to carry themselves with pride no matter what the world threw at them. So she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and walked slowly away from the dealership. But inside, her spirit felt bruised and cracked. Each step she took was heavy, as though dragging her heart behind her. She replayed the cruel words in her mind, the laughter, the sighs, the cold dismissal. They weren't just words. They were judgments, quick and sharp, cutting into her dignity. When she finally reached the bus stop, she sat quietly on the bench, her hands folded in her lap. People walked past her without knowing the storm she carried inside. To them, she was just another elderly woman resting her feet. But within her, the humiliation burned like fire. She felt invisible, yet at the same time exposed to the harshness of the world as the bus arrived and she climbed aboard. She promised herself she wouldn't let this incident define her. Yet, deep inside, a voice whispered the truth. It had hurt more than she wanted to admit. Little did she know, this painful moment was not the end of her story, was only the beginning. Because the person she would share it with that evening, her son, would not let such injustice go unanswered. What felt like humiliation now would soon transform into a lesson the dealership would never forget. Asterisk that evening. When the elderly woman returned home, her steps were slower than usual. She carried no shopping bags, no brochures, not even a smile. Her small house was quiet, the kind of quiet that sometimes feels heavier than noise. She placed her handbag on the table and sat down in her favorite chair by the window. Normally, she would rest her feet and hum a little tune. But that night, there was no song in her heart. Her son noticed immediately. He was a man of great success, used to handling problems in boardrooms, used to hearing reports and making decisions worth millions. But tonight, as he looked at his mother, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Her spirit weighed down. He walked over gently and asked, "Mama, is something wrong?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile meant to hide sadness. "Nothing, son. Just a long day." But he knew better. This was the woman who had raised him through hardship, who had worked late nights just to put food on the table, who had taught him to never let the world take away his dignity. To see her like this, quiet and distant, stirred something deep inside him. After a while, she sighed and finally spoke, her voice soft, almost as if she didn't want to burden him. She told him about her little adventure, how she had gone to the dealership just to look at the cars she admired. She explained how she had been ignored, dismissed, and finally shown the door. She repeated some of the words the salesman had said, her voice trembling as she recalled them. Her son listened carefully, his jaw tightening with each detail. To her, it had been a wound of the heart, but to him, it was an insult to the woman he loved most in this world. "Why didn't you tell them who you were?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Because that shouldn't matter. Respect should not depend on money or status. It should be given to everyone." Those words, so simple and so true, pierced him deeply. She was right. The dealership hadn't just insulted her, they had revealed their arrogance, their lack of humanity. And that was something he could not ignore. His mother, however, fell silent again. She looked out the window at the quiet street, her eyes far away. Inside her, the pain lingered. She wasn't angry in the way her son was. She was hurt in a deeper way, kind of pain that comes from being reminded that the world still judged her, not by her heart. Not by her wisdom, but by her appearance, her age, and the color of her skin as she sat there. She remembered other times in her life when she had been treated unfairly. When doors had been closed simply because she didn't fit the image others wanted. She had survived those moments too, but they had left scars. And now, even after all these years, even after raising a son who had become so successful, she still carried those scars. Her son reached for her hand. He held it firmly, as if trying to pass his strength into her. "Mama," he said quietly, "I promise you, they will regret this. No one disrespects you like that. Not now, not ever." But she only squeezed his hand and shook her head gently. "Don't waste your time on me. Just let it go." He looked into her eyes and saw the weariness there, but also the quiet strength. She wasn't asking for revenge. She wasn't asking for justice. All she wanted was dignity. And that made him even more determined. That night, long after she had gone to bed, her son sat awake, thinking. He pictured his mother standing alone in that showroom, being spoken to like she was less than human. He imagined the smug look on the salesman's face, the coldness in his tone, the way the others had watched. His chest tightened with anger, but also with resolve. This wasn't just about his mother. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or humiliated simply because they didn't look the part. His mother's pain had revealed something bigger. The world still needed to be reminded that respect was not for sale. Meanwhile, in her bedroom, the elderly woman lay awake. She stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy. She wasn't thinking about revenge. She wasn't even thinking about cars anymore. She was thinking about dignity, about how fragile it can feel when others decide you are unworthy of it. She thought of all the sacrifices she had made for her son, and how proud she was of the man he had become. But at that moment, she wished she could hide her pain from him, so he wouldn't have to carry it. She turned on her side and closed her eyes, whispering a prayer for strength. She prayed not for the dealership, not for the men who had insulted her, but for her son. She prayed that he would always remember kindness, even when the world forgot to show it. But what she didn't know was that her son was already planning something she never would have imagined. Her silent pain had become his loud determination. And by the next morning, the world around that dealership would look very different. The night had passed slowly for him. While his mother tried to sleep, turning from side to side in quiet exhaustion, her son sat in his study with the lights dimmed, staring at nothing in particular. His mind was restless. The image of his mother being dismissed, treated like she was invisible, played again and again in his head. He had seen her face when she told the story, brave, yes, but also hurt. The kind of hurt that no one should ever feel, especially not her. This was the woman who had carried him on her back when he was small. The woman who had sacrificed her own dreams so that he could chase his. The woman who had gone hungry so he would never have to. Every success he had, every step he had taken into the world of wealth and power had been built on her unshakable foundation. And now, To think that someone dared to humiliate her? That was something he could not forgive. He was not just a successful man. He was a billionaire. A self-made one. He had built empires out of ideas, turned risks into triumphs, and earned respect across industries. People who once doubted him now bowed to his vision. He owned companies, properties, and yes, cars more than he cared to count. Yet none of those things mattered to him as much as the look in his mother's eyes. The world knew him as a titan of business. A man whose name was printed in magazines and discussed in boardrooms. But his mother. She still saw him as her boy, the boy she once held close on nights when they had no electricity. The boy who promised her that one day he would give her everything she deserved. And he had kept that promise. She lived comfortably now, surrounded by every luxury. But what good were riches if the world still dared to treat her as though she had none? He thought carefully. He didn't want to simply storm into the dealership in anger. That would be too easy. He wanted to show them, to teach them, to open their eyes to the mistake they had made. And he had just the way to do it. The next morning, while the city was just beginning to wake, he opened the garage of his mansion. Inside rested some of the world's most envied cars. Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Bentleys, each gleaming like a jewel. But his eyes went straight to one. His Rolls Royce, black as midnight, polished to perfection. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol. A Rolls Royce was not purchased. It was earned. It carried not just luxury, but a statement of status that few in the world could claim. As the driver prepared it, he decided against sitting in the back seat like most billionaires would. No, he would drive it himself. Today was personal. Today was not about business deals or contracts. Today was about his mother. Meanwhile, his mother, still unaware of his plan, moved about the house quietly, trying to push away the memory of yesterday. She didn't know that her son had already decided to turn her pain into a lesson the dealership staff would never forget. He dressed in his usual sharp suit, but this time it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about walking into that dealership with dignity, power, and truth. Before leaving, he looked at his mother and kissed her on the forehead. She asked where he was going, and he simply smiled and said, "To take care of something." When the Rolls Royce pulled out of the gates, its engine purred like a beast that knew its own strength. The sunlight danced on its flawless surface, and people on the street turned their heads, unable to ignore its presence. This was not just a car arriving at a destination. It was respect on wheels. As he drove, his mind was steady. He wasn't going to shout. He wasn't going to argue. He was going to walk in calmly, reveal his truth, and watch their pride crumble. Because sometimes, silence and presence spoke louder than anger. The dealership that had once dismissed his mother would soon stand face to face with the reality of their mistake. They had looked at an elderly woman and seen nothing. Tomorrow, they would look at her son and realize they had insulted everything. For now, though his heart carried only one thought, this isn't about me. This is about her. The woman who gave me everything. The woman who deserves the respect of the world, and with that, he pressed the accelerator, guiding the Rolls Royce smoothly through the streets, heading straight for the very place that had broken his mother's spirit the day before. The lesson was about to begin. The morning sun poured across the dealership's wide glass windows, making the cars inside gleam like precious stones. Salesmen adjusted their ties, polished brochures on their desks, and prepared for another day of impressing customers. The air inside carried the usual mix of confidence and quiet arrogance. They thought they knew who belonged there and who did not. Outside, a deep rumble began to build, soft at first, then powerful enough to make heads turn. The sound was not like the ordinary cars pulling into the lot. It was smoother, richer, a sound that carried weight. Within moments, a sleek black Rolls Royce glided into view. moving with the grace of royalty. Every head in the dealership turned. Conversations paused. Phones lowered. For a moment, even the air felt heavier. A Rolls Royce did not simply arrive, it announced itself. The car rolled to a perfect stop right at the entrance. The staff, who yesterday had scoffed at an elderly woman's presence, now rushed toward the glass doors, eager to welcome whoever this distinguished visitor might be. Their polished smiles returned instantly. The same ones they had refused to offer her. When the driver's side door opened, they expected to see a wealthy businessman with a chauffeur. Instead, they saw him, the billionaire himself, stepping out calmly, his tailored suit catching the light, his presence commanding the space before he even spoke. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His very arrival had already taken the air out of the room. The manager hurried forward, almost tripping over his own feet in his eagerness to greet him. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice overly sweet. "Welcome to our dealership. How can we assist you today?" The billionaire's gaze swept across the showroom, his eyes cold but steady. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he let the silence stretch, forcing them to feel the weight of their own anticipation. People who had been so quick to dismiss his mother were now scrambling to impress him. He took a slow step inside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The staff followed him nervously, unsure of what to say, but desperate to please. Then he stopped. His eyes locked on the very car his mother had admired the day before, the black sedan that had stolen her attention. The one she had dared to touch before being pushed away. He walked toward it, his hands resting briefly on its smooth surface, just as hers had. The memory of her humiliation filled his chest with fire. But he kept his face calm. One of the salesmen stepped forward, the very same one who had spoken to his mother with disdain. Now his tone was full of flattery. "Ah, sir, this is one of our finest models. I'd be happy to walk you through all the features. I can assure you, it's a perfect choice." The billionaire turned his gaze on him, sharp and piercing. For a second, the salesman faltered under the weight of that stare. The man before him wasn't just another customer. He was someone who demanded respect without asking for it. The billionaire finally spoke, his voice calm but powerful. "Interesting. Yesterday, my mother asked about this same car. Do you remember her? An elderly woman. Simple dress, kind smile. She stood right here." The salesman froze, his mouth slightly open, his polished charm evaporating in an instant. The others shifted uncomfortably, realizing where this was going. "My mother," he continued, his voice steady but laced with steel, "was treated like she was worthless. She was ignored, laughed at, and told to leave. And yet today, when I walk in, suddenly the smiles appear. Suddenly, respect is offered." The room went silent. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Every staff member felt the sting of shame creeping across their faces. He walked slowly around the car, his hand gliding across its body, just as his mother's had. "This car is beautiful," he said softly, almost to himself. "But nothing in this building is more valuable than dignity. And that you failed to give her." The staff shifted nervously. Their eyes lowered, but he didn't stop. His words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Each syllable carried the weight of truth, striking harder than any raised voice could. He paused in front of the manager. "Do you know who my mother is? She is the reason I am who I am. She is the reason I stand here today, in front of you, as a man of success. And yet, you made her feel small. That is something no money can forgive." The dealership was silent. Not a word, not a cough, not even a breath dared to interrupt him. Finally, he straightened his jacket and gave a small, sharp nod. "I didn't come here to buy. I came here to remind you. Respect is free. It costs you nothing to give it. But when you fail to show it, the cost can be greater than you imagine. With that, he turned and walked out. His Rolls Royce waited patiently, its engine purring. As he stepped inside and drove away, the staff stood frozen, their polished smiles gone, replaced by shame. The same glass windows that had once reflected arrogance now mirrored their regret. The dramatic return was over. But its lesson would echo in that dealership for years to come. Asterisk. The billionaire's words had cut through the room like a blade. And for a long moment, silence weighed heavier than steel. Every salesman, every assistant, even the manager stood still. Their faces drained of the confidence they usually wore so easily. It was as if the walls of the dealership themselves had heard the truth and now stood in judgment of them. The billionaire didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need anger or theatrics. His calmness was more terrifying than rage. His presence alone commanded the room. Every step he took, every glance he gave, pressed shame deeper into their chests. The manager, desperate to salvage the moment, cleared his throat and tried to recover. "Sir, we sincerely apologize if there was any misunderstanding yesterday. Perhaps your mother was not properly recognized. I assure you, our staff meant no disrespect." The billionaire turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. His voice was steady, but it carried a weight that made the manager tremble. Misunderstanding. He let the word hang in the air. Tell me, what part of laughing at an elderly woman is a misunderstanding? What part of telling her to leave is a mistake? You didn't fail to recognize her, you failed to respect her. The staff shifted nervously. One of the salesmen, the very one who had spoken harshly to her, stepped back as if trying to melt into the floor. His earlier arrogance was gone. The polished shoes, the neat tie, the confident smirk, none of it mattered now. He looked smaller, exposed under the weight of the truth. The billionaire walked slowly toward him. Not with anger, but with unshakable control. He stopped just a few feet away and asked, "Do you remember her? Do you remember the woman who asked you politely about this car?" The salesman swallowed hard, his throat dry. I may have spoken out of turn. I didn't realize what?" The billionaire interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Didn't realize she was someone's mother? Didn't realize she had worth? Or didn't realize that your job is not to judge who deserves respect, but to give it freely?" The salesman's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The shame on his face said more than any apology could. The billionaire turned away from him, sweeping his gaze across the entire showroom. Customers who had been quietly watching now looked at the scene with wide eyes. They had seen everything, the dismissal, the arrogance, and now the humiliation of the staff. The very image of the dealership had been shattered in front of them. "Respect," the billionaire said slowly, as if carving the word into the air itself, is not reserved for the rich. It is not given only to those who look the part. Respect is for everyone, the elderly, the poor, the forgotten. And when you fail to give it, you fail as human beings, not just as salesmen. His words struck harder than any punishment. The staff lowered their heads, some with faces red from embarrassment, others biting their lips in silence. Even the manager's practiced mask of authority was gone, replaced by guilt he couldn't hide. The billionaire then pointed to the black sedan, same car his mother had admired. "That car, as beautiful as it is, means nothing compared to the dignity of the woman who stood here yesterday. You thought she was unworthy of your time, but she is worth more than every car in this building combined. Do you understand that?" The room was silent. The kind of silence that carried shame so heavy it pressed down on everyone like a storm cloud. No one dared to answer. No one dared to move. He let the silence linger a moment longer, then straightened his jacket. His eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained resolute. "My mother asked for nothing but kindness, and you gave her humiliation. She will forgive you because her heart is pure, but I will not. Consider this your lesson. Remember it every time someone walks through those doors, because the next person you dismiss may not be as forgiving. With that, he turned and walked out of the dealership. His Rolls Royce awaited, its polished surface reflecting the stunned faces left behind. As the door closed behind him, the staff stood frozen, each of them wrestling with the shame that clung to their skin like a weight they could not shake off. Some tried to whisper excuses to each other, but their voices died quickly. There was no excuse for what had happened. They had been exposed not by anger, not by violence, but by truth spoken with dignity and strength. For years, they would remember that day not for the car that rolled in, but for the confrontation that tore away their pride. And every time an elderly person, or someone who looked ordinary, walked through those doors, they would feel that sting of shame again. The billionaire didn't look back. He didn't need to. The confrontation was complete. The lesson had been delivered, and the shame would remain with them long after his Rolls Royce had disappeared down the street. Asterisk. The roar of the Rolls Royce faded as it left the dealership, but the silence inside remained heavy. The staff stood like statues, unable to shake off the sting of the confrontation. They had expected a wealthy man to walk in and honor them with a purchase. Instead, he had walked out leaving nothing but shame behind. And that was the most painful part of all. The billionaire drove with steady hands, his expression calm, his eyes focused. He wasn't interested in revenge. He hadn't come to crush them with his money or to buy their respect with a purchase. No, his mission was simpler and far more powerful. He wanted them to feel the consequences of their arrogance, and he knew they would never forget the moment they lost the trust and the business of the one man who could have easily bought half the cars in their showroom back at home. His mother sat quietly by the window, her knitting resting in her lap. She looked up when she heard the sound of the Rolls Royce pulling into the driveway. She smiled gently, unaware of the storm he had just caused. To her, he was still her boy, the one who used to come home with scraped knees. The one who once promised her that she would never have to struggle again. He stepped inside, loosened his tie, and walked over to her. She looked at him carefully, sensing something in his eyes. "You went to the dealership, didn't you?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "Yes, Mama, I went." She sighed, her heart heavy. "I told you not to waste your time on me. What's done is done." But he knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. His voice was gentle but firm. "Mama, you are never a waste of time. Yesterday, they saw you as someone small. Today, they learned the truth. They learned that you are the reason I am who I am. And I wanted them to understand that respect should never depend on money, age, or appearance." Her eyes watered, not from sadness this time, but from pride. She squeezed his hand and whispered, "You've always had a strong heart. That's worth more than any car." Meanwhile, at the dealership, whispers spread like wildfire. Customers who had witnessed the scene began to talk, and word moved quickly beyond the showroom. The story of the arrogant staff who mistreated an elderly woman only to face her billionaire son soon became more than just a memory. It became a lesson passed from mouth to mouth. By the end of the week, their reputation had taken a blow that no advertisement could repair. Some staff left, unable to handle the shame. Others stayed, forced to carry the memory every time they greeted a new customer. And every time they saw an older person, someone dressed simply, or someone they might once have judged, they remembered the piercing words, "Respect is free." The billionaire never returned to that dealership. He could have bought the car elsewhere, or 10 just like it, but that wasn't the point. The true victory wasn't in owning another luxury, it was in showing that his mother's dignity was worth far more. By refusing to spend a single dollar there, he left them with something stronger than money. the echo of their own failure, his mother. Though still carrying the memory of that painful day, also carried something else now. She carried the comfort of knowing that her son saw her worth clearly, that he would never let the world forget it. And in her heart, she prayed quietly not for the downfall of the men who had wronged her, but for their awakening. She hoped they had learned, truly learned, that kindness and respect are the greatest riches of all.